مرحبا بكم مرة ثالثة ورابعة حضورنا الكريم، ضيوفنا من داخل المملكة وخارجها في منتدى أسبار الدولي 2019. ضيفنا اليوم من جمهورية إيرلندا الدكتور كولم ريلي، وهو مدير أول في منظمة OCO وأحد خبراء الاقتصاد وتخطيط المدن. سيتحدث عن المدن في المستقبل ودورها في تنمية الاقتصاد وكيفية إدارة المواهب والابتكارات.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone, good morning. I've got the last slot of the morning, the most difficult slot. I've got slides to show you as well, which I hate doing. And I'm going to walk around if that's okay, because if I stand behind this podium, you won't see me because I'm quite short. So it's a pleasure to be back in Riyadh again. I've been coming to Riyadh for the last 4 years, pretty regularly. And it's interesting to see how Riyadh is evolving every time I've come over the last 4 years. What I'm going to talk about and what I've been asked to talk about is just a very thin piece of how economies develop. I want to talk about cities, and cities as the future engines of not simply economic growth, but also how they attract in talent and how they by themselves produce higher levels of innovation. And before I start on cities, I wanted to tell you something about how I see parallels between what I see in Saudi Arabia and what I saw at home in Ireland. I'm originally from Ireland. I grew up in a village of 300 people, and I now live in a city of 12 million people. And my parents often wondered, how did this happen? How did I end up living in a place that they have no recognition for and no appreciation of? And when I meet people in Saudi Arabia, the first question I ask them in Riyadh or Jeddah is, where are you from? And they're normally from somewhere else, but they've migrated to the city for a very specific reason, either for a livelihood or to do something different. And that in itself is the story that I'm going to involve. I have to declare, however, that I don't have all the answers. There is a problem with what I'm going to show you here this morning. And the problem is this: my experience is only limited to cities that are already in countries that have high levels of GDP and have been developed for some time. In other words, they are trying to resuscitate themselves. And I think we're fading in and out here a bit on sound, but I'll continue going. So what I want to tell you is a story that is not directly applicable to Saudi Arabia, but one that I think you should try to learn some lessons from. There are 3 things in life that you can't run away from. There are many trends in life, and we saw some earlier on in the earlier presentation of things that are temporary hiatus that worry us in the world: environmental considerations, pollution, social issues. But there are 3 things in life that are underlying trends that you cannot come away from. First is global demographics. Global demographics are changing. That change is not going to be reversed, and it is fundamentally altering how we see the world. For the first time by 2030, this chart, by the way, comes from the World Bank, but for the first time by 2030, we are going to see that the majority of young populations will not be in what we've traditionally called the old world, Western Europe or North America. Actually, they will all be in another part of the world, and they'll be doing different things. So you cannot beat demographics. And when I looked once at Vision 2030, the most interesting I saw in Vision 2030 was, of course, I recognized, as most other countries have, a lot of the other elements that were hoping to be achieved. But the most interesting was observing where Saudi Arabia sat at the junction of the fastest growing demographic economies of the world. Because as Marco Polo was able to prove back in 1250, demographics drives real economic growth, demographics drives innovation. So you cannot beat demographics. The second thing I want to talk about is you cannot beat technology evolution. We just had that conversation earlier on, and I wanted to share with you a thought about this. We talk about Industry 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, but actually they're not really, they're just convenient labels that we use. The truth is that technology has been evolving over the last 120 years with two key focuses. The first focus has been miniaturization, and the second focus has been personalization. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, they're the only two key drivers. Can I do it from a smaller position than I was doing before? And can I do it tailored down to individual needs? Whether you're in medicine, automotive, or aerospace, that has been the evolution. Now, what has slowed that evolution has been things like economics, economic cycles, the costs of manufacturing, etc. But the trend itself is driving that way and will continue that way. So it's going to be precision medicine, precision automotives that are tailored to the individuals and that are manufactured from smaller factories or smaller assembly units in the future. That is an undeniable trend. It started back about the 1800s, and it has been accelerating since about 1880. And that prognosis of speed is not going to slow down. It does give us another problem in cities, by the way, which is the rate of the acceleration of the technology is bewildering us and is exceeding our capacity to adapt. But I'm not going to discuss that here. That's an entirely different conversation. The third thing I want to talk about is a piece of my own research. Why do people invest? When I say invest, I don't mean money, I mean time, energy, head space, brain space. This is an analysis of 800 chief executives around the world as to why they invest. And I asked them for the reasons that they wanted to invest in either particular geographies or particular environments. And they listed them all kindly 1 to 10 for me. What was very interesting to all sectors is that the key reason for investing wasn't about incentives, it wasn't about tax rates, it wasn't about capital. It was about access to markets, access to clients, and access to human capital. So they're the three key trends that drive everything we're doing in the world today. We're chasing demographics because that's where markets are. We're looking at technology evolutions that are moving towards further degrees of miniaturization and personalization. And we're also looking at investment that's only chasing markets and ideas, human capacity, and where people can buy stuff. So let's talk about, that's my first section, let's talk about global cities and metropolitan cities, how they have evolved also. I think around 60 years ago, there were, 150,000 people living in Riyadh, and there's now 6 to 7 million people living in Riyadh. Riyadh by itself is larger than all cities in Europe bar two, which are Paris and London. It has already exceeded that scale. And if you look at the trend of what's happening in cities, there are a couple of key challenges here. Firstly, cities are generating more than 80% of global GDP. Now, I don't actually approve of GDP as a measurement, but as a proxy, let's just use it as a tool to understand concentration. So cities are generating 80% of global GDP. And the economic powers are actually sitting in the top 600 cities in the world. So if you think about what I said about 80%, the top 600 are driving all of that GDP growth. 380 of those cities currently exist in what the OECD used to call the developed world. Whether it is developed or not, I think, is a moot question. But let's use that language. That's what everybody understands. However, the challenge is, what are the other cities doing? And what you're seeing is cities starting to pull in and become globally recognized as environments where things are happening, where specific are happening. They're either gateways to communities or they're developing human capacity on an entirely different scale. So we have to understand that cities truly are the economic center of economic activity. They suck in economic activity and they regenerate it faster. And they have a very particular characteristic. The second thing about cities is that they're normally faster growing and more resilient than the national economies in which they exist in. This is a phenomenon that London, of course, has shown in the UK, but New York shows it in the US, and you're also going to see it in other geographies emerging over time. So if a recession hits, you see the city rejuvenates very quickly, but the national economy lags behind. This, by the way, creates a huge social issue, and I'm not going to address that, but there's a moral obligation to address that social issue, which is you leave people behind inside the national envelope, which is not, of course, correct. And finally, cities link people together. They're the fundamental driver of globalization. Now, globalization is currently a little bit of a nasty word at the moment because people think it refers to the subjugation of culture or the subjugation of identity. Actually, it doesn't. That's just how it's been hijacked. Globalization is a bottom-up movement around the world where people know how to interact with each other, they learn how to interact with each other, and they cooperate and they consolidate with each other. The top-down motive of globalization has been a differentiating force is not at all correct in my view. So cities are the links to globalization. The reason I know this is that coming from a village of 300 people and living in a city now of 10 million plus people, I come to Riyadh and I come to Jeddah many more times than I go to any other city in Saudi Arabia. Why? Because that's where the connection point is for me. The other interesting thing about cities is global headquarters are always concentrated in cities. This is a very important characteristic of where cities play. They tend to function and drive in economic activity because that's where companies want to be. There's an interesting challenge on the city side about this. There are about 8,000 companies in the world last year that over $1 billion. $1 billion of turnover. By 2035, there will be 15,000 such companies, but we don't know the names of the other 7,000 yet. But we know they're most likely going to be created within city environments. So what you tend to see is that the key cities around the world suck in these major conglomerates and these companies, and around them build an ecosystem of smaller companies, and they concentrate economic activity on that basis. The model, by the way, I'm not going to bore you with this, but there is a model of resilience and productivity within city environments which you see no matter where you are, where investments in R&D, in infrastructures, and all of the accompanying tool sets around cities effectively give you more flexible human capacity, better value chains, higher quality goods and services, more data, better decision making, and all of these aspects drive productivity, allow you to create more jobs, and rejuvenate situations when economic situations tend to threaten them. So you get this cycle of rejuvenation within cities, which of course enables them to grow faster and suck in even more position, which is why I said earlier the top cities in the world are galvanizing 80% of global GDP. However, what the smart cities are figuring out, and I don't mean smart in the ICT sense, is they're starting to realize that cities have to become ecosystems where a lot of varying elements of the economy coexist together. The earlier presentation talked very interestingly around innovation and what innovation. Actually, innovation is caused by multiple layers of activities, and normally they're happening within a city. So you have, for example, what I call a coordination framework. You have a government body pulling strings, building infrastructure, organizing, and building frameworks that things can happen within. And have very, very focused access to funding mechanisms. You have company life cycles, but most significantly, you have human capacity development. Human capacity development is if you go back to my earlier slide on why people invest, is the single greatest attribute of why people want to invest in an economy. They're chasing human resources. There's a specific reason that's evolved for that in the last 10 years. Historically, economic development was driven by access to capital and the availability of capital, but the cost of capital has neutralized worldwide pretty much at this stage. So the only real value is the value of human beings and their ability to come up with new ideas and see new ways of doing things. So that skills framework is essential in cities. The other part you see in the city model is quality of life and, of course, sustainability, because a city has to sustain itself. If it chokes itself off environmentally or from a quality of life point of view, it has nowhere to go. So the model that cities seem to be trying to use, or at least the most advanced cities that I've seen, tend to see all of these elements being balanced together. What makes the characteristics of a city? What makes those cities work well? How do they become internationally recognized as centers that galvanize economic activity? There are 6 things I think are very important. The first is economic resilience. They show an ability to diversify their economy, and so when one part of the economy is down, the other part of the economy is up, so they balance it off consistently. They're always transformative. So they always change the dynamics of either an industry or a sector based on what they understand. That's very important. Cities bring together people and ideas that can actually transform how a particular industry might work. They spend a lot of time on capacity building, either through spillover or just meeting nice people. They start to learn collectively in a very interesting social network mechanism from each other. So people are constantly learning. The fourth thing is very important, is they're very visible. They put their hand up. You'll notice this actually if you read any of the key business magazines. Cities individually worldwide are putting their hands up. I've personally worked with 4 or 5 cities who wanted to achieve greater recognition worldwide, and it wasn't that they didn't have the capability, that they were not putting their hands up globally to say, we can do this here, you should be talking to us on this basis. The fifth area, I think, is evidence-based. They're always based on facts. They're not based on the superlative sense of feeling, or maybe it should be this, or I think it'd be nicer if we did that. It's always based on a fact-based regime that allows them to develop. And the last thing, and very significant, is collaborative leadership. There is a co-axis of existence in these cities between academia, between industry, and between the government itself and the people that are represented by the government, so that there is a natural correlation of activity and collaboration between them. They're the characteristics that enable a city tick over constantly, rejuvenate itself, and attract in further economic activity. So, let's just think about what we've talked about before I go on for a bit. I've talked about the key trends, demographics, and by the way, Riyadh, and I'm going to personalize Riyadh in a second, is interestingly from a geolocation about where it accesses global populations, more importantly, the age of those populations, and the growing GDP proportion of those populations. So that's the first thing I talked about. The second I talked about was how technology is changing, but of course technology moving towards miniaturization and technology moving towards personalization opens up doors that would not have been opened before for other players to come in and new cities to take a piece of that particular action. And the last thing I talked about was, why do people invest? And people invest because they're chasing human capacity and access to markets. If you fix those two, you can fix the roads and everything else later on. But those are the two elements that chase markets. And we know that cities are going to centralize and concentrate all economic activity globally over the next 100 years. That's not going to change. And the reason we know it's not going to change is that if you went back 100 years ago, the world was effectively comprised of city-states that were doing exactly the same thing. So in a certain way, we're going back to the future here. If I was looking at Riyadh today, there are 4 things I think Riyadh needs to do to put its hand up to become internationally recognized as a city that starts to play along this node of one of the most significant international cities in the world. I think it's got to attract investment to transform Riyadh. So it's got to look at very specific sectors and how it's going to unlock those sectors over the next decade in very specific areas. And I don't mean areas like ICT. I mean specifically what area of ICT. And I don't mean medicine. I mean specifically what area of medicine is it going to be internationally recognized for in a decade's time. No more of this esoteric strategic stuff about, I want to be good at ICT, or I want to be good at health, medicine, or no. What specifically are you going to be good at? That's focus. The second thing is you've got to develop the workforce. Now, I'm not saying that education standards in Saudi Arabia are very high. Everybody I meet is wonderfully articulate, but you've got to continue to develop that workforce from both a commercial and a technical perspective. And don't ever think that job is ever done. That job is never done within a city. The best cities that we know are constantly rejuvenating that education cycle, so you're going to have to continue to push that. The third thing I want to talk about briefly, which was touched very well by the last speaker, is the innovation economy. So, look, I talked about capital levels equalizing worldwide. What companies and businesses are looking for ideas. They're looking for where to go next. One thing I've always amazed about is the best ideas aren't always found where you think they will. And I had a brief experience of this when I visited Saudi Arabia last winter, and I traveled out into the coast, out into the countryside. And I realized how people here innovated to survive without all of the mod cons that we have today, and how they understood how to innovate their way of life. So you've got to everybody has the ability to innovate, by the way. There is no reason why you don't innovate. Adopting technologies, adopting ways of working is okay, but you can take those principles and figure out how to do them yourselves. That's innovation. And we should remember that historically at least from a global perspective, the source of all innovation came from the East. It did not come from the West. And you sit in the East, by the way. So if you go back to our particular experience in Europe of the Renaissance and periods of that, it was the Eastern scholars coming in with their innovations and technology that actually started to change how Europe perceived industrialization, how Europe perceived science. So go back to where you came from, because that's probably where the answer sits. But you've got to develop that form of innovation economy, not by importing it, but by developing it internally within the city. And finally, distinct and competitive business communities. I see this as evolving in Riyadh as I travel around. The financial services centre, I see some of the healthcare centres. You've got to increase the market competitiveness and build communities into those focus areas, because that's what the best cities appear to be doing worldwide. So how are we doing for time? Anybody tell me? I'm conscious of not running over. So I've got 3 minutes left. I was going to just pause there, and I was going to ask if anybody wants to ask me any questions or make comments on what I've just talked about. It's a pretty heavy download in 25 minutes, but I thought I would stop there and ask if you wanted to ask me any questions. I have a recipe that I'm leaving you for the city of Riyadh. I've only visited, I'm only talking about Riyadh here and how cities evolve, but I thought I would leave it there for the moment. Any thoughts? Okay. Oh, one question. Please. Do we have a microphone? No? You're not from Riyadh, okay. You ask me the question and I'll repeat it.
So I'm not from Riyadh. This is very interesting. The dynamics in big cities and all the majors that you mentioned come from a university town, so University Kaust. So it's a university and a town all together. So community, all services. Keep reflecting on the difference between living in a big metropolitan city like Riyadh and living in a smaller university towns that has probably parts of what you mentioned, but not everything that has, it's still limited in some way. So I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And KAUST has a growing and formidable reputation internationally. Actually. So ironically, I would say better than some of the cities in Saudi Arabia, KAUST is already internationally recognized, at least in certain distinct areas. More to do, let's be honest, everywhere in the world has more to do. But let me give you a mindset on KAUST, okay? KAUST needs to concentrate activities because that's how research, fundamental research, works best, okay? It's an economies of scale game. What I would suggest is that KAUST doesn't belong to a city. It belongs to multiple cities within Saudi Arabia, because it is an arm reach out into international research programs as well, and it can bring them back into place. So I would argue that you don't belong to your own city. You belong as a national asset to multiple cities in very distinct areas of focus. So and you see that, if I give you an example, in pharmaceuticals today, Cambridge belongs to London. Like it or not, by the way, I don't belittle Cambridge by saying this. I actually empower them by saying this. They belong as a research engine delivering product into the London city area, which makes London more potent, but they also deliver into other cities as well. So I would see that parallel working quite well. However, it's your cooperation with industry within a city construct will be the key driver of your success, because only when you exploit what you develop can you really measure it as impact. Thank you. Great question. By the way, I've only given you an answer that I know from other places. I am sure Saudi Arabia will find a better answer. This gentleman. Do we have a microphone? Just ask this gentleman. Oh.
Assalamu alaikum. Could you elaborate on what kind of investment do you recommend to make Riyadh metropolitan?
Very good.
Thank you.
So this is a great question. The question was, what type of investment would I recommend to make Riyadh internationally recognized? Okay, so that's if I paraphrase that correctly. So what I would suggest is that I'm a member of the Royal Society in London, and there's a textbook in the Royal Society when you go into the entrance, where there's a book where people used to sign in about researchers from all around the world would sign in, and every day they turn over a different page. And about 5 years ago, I saw that they turned over a page from the end of the 19th century, and all the signatories were in Arabic. What I would suggest Riyadh does is it builds a foresight project where it identifies physically what it's good at and what part of the global sectors it is going to become number 1, 2, or 3 in the next decade. And invests in its own capacity, not external capacity, to develop that capability to become that internationally recognized leader. So I would suggest that it's got to be something around the areas of medicine, and I can prove why, because historically medicine had strong roots within this country, but it's a different type of medicine than what we know today. I would suggest that it does something on energy, because energy, and I don't mean necessarily oil and gas, but the future of energy. And I would suggest personally that it does something around new financial services. And I don't mean the old historical banking system. Please remember, in the growing economies of the world, based on that demographic slide, they won't be using banks. They will be using some other form of financial transactions. So if I was given a choice, I would do a study very quickly over where those trends are going, look at the data and say this is where Riyadh can become the center of the world. But very distinct areas, not everything in the world, because no matter where you go, whether it's Massachusetts, whether it's California, you don't see everybody trying everything. Very narrowly focus on an area that they know they can achieve in. Education. Look, honestly speaking, on education, before you do anything in the world, there are 3 things you must do. Educate, educate, educate. There is nothing that beats education. In fact, even if you don't do any of those studies, if you're educating, you don't have to worry about it because people will figure it out themselves. It's easier if they have that framework, but education, fundamental to what you do. And I would say education, not just at the university level, I mean education at primary level with problem solving, education at secondary level, and please, think about how other countries have developed vocational skills. Vocational skills, further education, unlock brand new industries. And we should think about that. But to me, that's such a fundamental, having roads. This gentleman, did you want to? I'm conscious of time, so someone's going to keep me right on time. If you want to kill me, I should shut up. We should go. I should finish. I'll go. Okay. Very good. That's it.